Hi, welcome to safeFBDC Live number 2, today again live from Tech Quartier. My name is Paula Landers, I'm your host for this evening, and I'm the marketing manager of the Financial Big Data Cluster. Welcome, and it's great to have you here. We did this once before, and that time we talked about ESG data and what impact this kind of data has. Today, we are looking into central banks and how they use big data. Maybe you have never thought about this before, but it's a thing. Central banks use big data. This topic stems from one of our use cases in the Financial Big Data Cluster, and we're doing research there. So we think you should profit from our research and learn more about what we do. Today, I have 3 wonderful guests with me. They are all super smart and have studied a lot, and they will tell you more about this thing. If you have, during the sessions, any questions, you see a chat on the side in YouTube, and you can post your questions there. My wonderful assistant, Luisa, will screen those questions, and at the end of the discussion, I will get those questions, and the experts will answer them. Now, let me introduce my wonderful guests. My first guest today is Sasha Steffen. Sasha is a full professor at the Frankfurt School of Finance. He also leads the use case of the Financial Big Data Cluster that looks into AI and monetization. And if he has the time, like usually in the morning from 8 to 10, he plays tennis. Hi, Sasha. My second guest has a wonderful name, just like me. Her name is Paula. Paula Kokoma is an assistant professor at the Frankfurt School of Finance. Her research goes into how investors process information and how they make decisions based on that. She is a fully trained Ashtanga yoga teacher. And my third guest is not from the Frankfurt School of Finance, but from the ECB. His name is Michael Ehrmann. He has a doctor in economics from the University of Florence. And if you ever meet him, you should ask him how soccer results in the World Cup influence the stock markets. And he will talk to you probably a long time, and then you can ask him for his homemade Apfelwein. Hi. Okay, my wonderful guests are here, and we will immediately go to the first question. My first question is for Sasha. Sasha, can you tell us what is big data? Can you give us a definition?
Sure. So thank you very much also for hosting this great event today. It's actually a pleasure to be here. So I think that question is a little bit more loaded than you might probably think, because so for engineering or people working in statistics, this might be relatively clear what big data actually is. But for financial economists, there actually hasn't been very comprehensive definition so far, and people have basically just begun to kind of frame that and try to understand what big data actually is. So the way people currently think, or financial economists at least currently think about that, is that big data has 3 properties, so to speak. So one property is data has to be large in size. So we talk about sample size, so a large number of observations. The second property is that it has to have a high dimension, meaning that in addition to a lot of observation, it also has to have a large number of variables that we want to look at, right? So like basically inflation and GDP and all these kind of things. And a third dimension that has to be there is complexity or complex structure, right? So the first 2 dimensions could basically mean, okay, we just have big data, we have a large number of data, 2 million observations and so on, but that's basically what people are used or have been used to for a very long time. But that sort of level of complexity, sort of handling not sort of like the regular data, but what we call like unstructured data. So data that's coming in form of text, it's coming in form of pictures, or maybe even in form of audio. So basically that type of additional complexity that adds to that. So all of these 3 dimensions from a financial economist perspective make up big data, so to speak.
Thank you. We will probably get to some of the aspects you mentioned now later again, because it's a big thing. My next question goes to Michael. I have been to a lot of banks, but I've never been to a central bank. Can you tell me what makes a central bank special? Why do we have a central bank? What is it?
Sure, with pleasure. So also from my side, thanks a lot for having me here. I'm really looking forward to the discussions. So if you haven't been to a central bank, I can only encourage you to go.
Can I
You
come?
live in Frankfurt, I presume. Yes, indeed.
Yeah?
First
Okay, I'll
of all,
come.
Frankfurt has two central banks, which is quite special. And both of these actually have opportunities to visit. Now, with Corona right now, it's a little bit more difficult, but the ECB has a visitor center. And the Bundesbank has a Geldmuseum, both of which I think are very nice and very interesting. So, they are worthwhile visiting. But it's true. You would normally not have to go to a central bank, whereas presumably at some point in time you have to go to a commercial bank. And the reason why you don't have to go is because you cannot open an account with us. So we are not a for-profit institution. We are a public institution. And our main product that you actually are very well aware of, you have it in your pocket, presumably, the banknotes, basically, they carry the signature of the ECB president. And so we are issuing the currency here in the euro area. And our main assignment is to ensure the stability of prices. So basically, if you have never really reflected or bothered about what central banks do, I think that already means we're doing our job reasonably well, because we are taking care of inflation. Inflation is nothing that apparently bothers people. So that means people can concentrate on other more productive things than worrying about deflation or hyperinflation. So in that sense, I'm quite happy to hear that actually. Now, how do we do this? Well, we do a lot of economic analysis covering the real economy, obviously inflation as well. We look at financial markets, the financial sector. We have a lot of analysis of banking behavior, for example. We look into issues of financial stability. And we also have a research department. And of course, we increasingly make use of big data, which we'll talk more about afterwards.
I think that's very understandable for everyone. But I'll take you up on the offer to come and visit. I actually live close by, and I really wanted to go into the big tower after Corona. Okay, now my first question for Paula. What could central banks actually use big data for, and what challenges do they face when using big data?
So thank you, Paula, from my side again for inviting us and introducing us all to this presentation format. So central banks use big data in the same way that everybody does, which is to gather information. What kind of information is important for central bank then becomes things that help them in pursuing their goal of price stability. So it could be more detailed information in prices, kind of web scraping. It could be more detailed information on consumer sentiment, how they are spending their money, and how the economic outlook is going to be. And the biggest two challenges I think that central bank face is that first, this kind of data, by being big data, is quite hard to process. So it is not obvious that everybody has the skills to process and store it properly. And even though you may have access to the data, there are a lot of ethical concerns that come related to owning this data. The central banks are in a business of trust. They rely on the whole economy trusting that they are doing their work and they are stabilizing these prices for us so that we value the euro as a mean of payment. And if someone thinks this data is not being properly stored or has the right privacy concerns in mind, then things can easily spiral out and we can be in catastrophic scenarios because of lack of trust. So those are the two biggest challenges that I would say.
Okay, so with this many challenges, Michael, can you give us an example from like your work life, from your daily business, how you actually use big data? And what tools do you use? How do you?
Sure, with pleasure. Thanks. Yeah, there's lots of examples, so I'm not even sure where to start. Let me maybe start with an example from a different central bank. I had the pleasure of working at the Bank of Canada for a couple of years. And there, the colleagues in the international department have the task to monitor what's going on in the Chinese economy. And what they basically do is, they read a lot of newspapers, they have contacts there, they go and visit, but they were always struggling with the labor market indicators because labor market indicators were not very cyclical, so there was not a lot of movement there. They were not really capturing the labor force. And so they said we need to have a better sense of what's going on in the labor market than what we can get just from the official statistics. So what they did is they basically sort of got a subscription of all the mainland Chinese language newspapers. They applied textual analysis, and they were extracting all information that relates to labor markets from there. And they sort of constructed their own labor market indicator. And then they actually realized that what they can extract from these newspapers explains wages and credit growth actually better than the official data. So that seems to suggest that if you do textual analysis, you actually have better, superior information about where the economy is going. And I like this example in particular because central bank staff, especially those who are sort of monitoring other economies, they need to do a lot of reading and talk to people and sort of assemble that information. If we can have machines doing that, we can actually do more interesting analysis in our time. So I think this is a very nice example of how these data can be used.
Okay. I recently read in a paper that I think Sasha wrote that nowadays about 80% of central banks use big data. But what about the other 20%? Could any of you give me an answer why a central bank nowadays would not yet use big data? Sasha?
Oh, I just wanted to say that's actually a question for Michael, I believe.
Yeah, okay, Michael.
Well, I clearly don't work in one of those central banks that do not use big data. I mean, I can only imagine that they have a different depth of big data. I mean, the way Sasha described big data, I'm pretty sure every central bank uses big data. I cannot imagine that you can do with just data that are not as complex as Sasha has described them. Maybe let me give you another example why this is so important. All central banks will have access to bank balance sheets, and we've been monitoring bank balance sheets ever since I'm in central banking. At least this is more than 20 years. And that already in itself is complex data. It depends maybe on the size of your country and how many banks you have. But there's a lot of variables. There's a lot of banks typically, and you have all this data over time. Now that helps us understand how banks sort of pass on or are affected by changes in monetary policy. But now more recently, we have a lot of countries where we not only have data on banks, but we also have very detailed data on the loans that these banks actually give to firms and households. And that sort of takes us one step further. So now we can not only see how banks sort of react to monetary policy, we can also see how they transmit our monetary policy to the real economy. And this is so powerful. I cannot imagine that a central bank would not want to use that. I'd be surprised. If indeed there are central banks that don't do this, then it must be a lack of skills, effectively. That's the only thing I can, because as such, this is very complex data.
Would you like to add to that, Sasha, or?
No, I think Michael described this very well. I think also the last point is crucial, maybe because of also the size of the country or the lack of skills, sort of the question. It's costly, right? The more you get into models, the more complex the models, the more costly it is to do that. And maybe it's a decision about, okay, the marginal benefit of doing that is just not worthwhile doing. But I fully agree with Michael and his examples. I think the new data and particularly everything that has been also collected, also based on additional regulation that was put in place after the global financial crisis, all of that enables us to become much more efficient in things that we do. Also, central banks become more efficient, but also to ask much more interesting questions that we actually used to and could actually ask also as economists when looking at these data as well.
That's a good Stichwort. In the FBDC, Sasha, you are asking interesting questions. Could you tell our audience what the ideal results could be that come out of the safeFBDC of your research there?
Yeah, let me briefly describe what we're doing, because I think what Michael described, and I think he made very clear that central banks are already doing a lot in terms of big data analysis and or analyzing these kind of data, and so the idea of the use case monetary policy, so to speak, is to kind of add to that, is right, improve databases, improve models to support monetary decisions, also for basically people outside to kind of understand better what monetary policy actually does. So the first step that we did is to try to figure out, okay, what kind of questions are actually central banks interested in. Michael named them basically in his introductory statement. Basically, there's banking supervision, there could be forecasting, there's financial stability assessment, central bank communication, something Michael was contributing to a lot also already in the past and also recently. But also, for example, climate change is now a very interesting topics for central banks as well. So what we do is basically, in these different areas, we specify different case studies, right? Case studies, questions, so to speak, in which big data techniques, also machine learning, artificial intelligence can be of an example, or can be of help and an advantage, so to speak. And one question that we are interested in, for example, is kind of how can we measure and assess climate change exposure that banks have, and how can we actually stress test these exposures, right? And how can we use textual or any other kind of unstructured data to make advances in addressing these kind of important questions, right? So you can see that there are basically two dimensions of questions that are relevant. On the one hand, there are questions that are particularly interesting for policymakers, and that can be beneficial for them in terms of, for example, improving the databases for them or broadening the toolbox, so to speak, that they have, right? But also in the second dimension, and for me as an academic and also researcher, of course, our focus is more naturally on how can we actually also contribute to the academic literature, and particularly also to that is in a way more of general interest to people who are actually reading that, right? And to ensure that this to ensure that this is kind of that the actually interesting question that we ask, we basically have a broad network of people. So we talk to more informally also, of course, to central bankers like Michael, but also from people from different departments. But we've also set up a kind of an infrastructure in the sense that we have an academic advisory board that actually help us to assess, okay, what kind of questions are interesting to look at, right?
Yeah.
So that is kind of how we approach that. And then we have different kind of milestones based on which we kind of address the different questions that we want to ask.
Okay, so there's still a lot of research to be done, but it's super interesting. And you mentioned different data sources, and because it's in the title of our event today, I quickly want to drop in and see how social media comes into play. Because about a third of all internet traffic happens on social media, and I know that the ECB is also tapping into social media. Michael, again, could you please tell us what kind of social media you use and how you use that? Are you on TikTok with the ECB? Is that anything that helps with inflation, or what's your approach?
Yeah, so we've become a lot more media. We have an Instagram account, we have a Twitter account, actually ECB Press account. So we are actively using social media to convey messages, which helps us to audience would normally not reach. I mean, normally, we are holding press conferences with specialized media. They report about us on financial papers, but it's very hard to reach the broader public through these channels. So we're using social media to do this. And not only are we actively studying social media. So I actually have worked on that, and maybe that can connect to comment. So we're also analyzing how social media users are discussing the ECB. So a paper where we were web scraping all the tweets that deal with the ECB. And again, this is something, as Paula mentioned, where we needed to be very cautious about ensuring that we're adhering to the data protection. So we have a data protection officer, obviously, in the ECB, and we very carefully sort of set up the data collection, the data handling, the data storage, in order to make sure that we are fully in line with the rules to which we have to adhere to. So basically, people can trust us that we're not misusing their personal data in any way.
There was a bit of a connection problem, I think. I'm not sure everything got through, you said, Michael. Well, you said that the ECB is actually using many social media channels to inform the public and is holding press conferences, but also you did research into Twitter and scrape the data that comes from there. And then you mentioned that you're doing it in a very secure way, right?
Yes, because as Paula mentioned, it's important that these are personal data according to the Euro.
Yeah. The connection
data protection
not...
laws.
The connection is
sorry,
not very
it looks
good.
good on
I'm
my
sorry.
side, I'm afraid.
But maybe we'll just hand over to Paula. So what dangers could be in store if central banks rely on social media data? And what concerns might one have?
Yeah, so the issue with social media is that they are in this business of trapping you inside them. So Instagram earns the most money the longer you stay inside the app. The same with Facebook, the same with TikTok. So they tend to show content that people like to see. So if I like puppies, I will be shown puppies all day long if that keeps me inside Instagram or TikTok trap. But what this makes is that it is creating polarization in people's views, where someone's opinion keeps being reinforced and reinforced until they start thinking that everyone thinks like them. But why this polarization is dangerous for central banks is because they rely on coordination. So when you pay me with that euro currency, you are only allowed to do that because I accept the euro currency as a currency that is valid, that stores value, and that can be used as a means of payment. But if under social media, I have been seeing news that the euro is weak, and I fear it, most likely I won't want to accept your euros and demand you to pay me in dollars, or worse, Bitcoin, or something that is really not controlled by any central bank, and where we lose this coordination capacity of price stabilities that central banks provide.
Okay. So you're saying that Bitcoin is a bad thing, but I've heard that something like the digital euro might come up. Would that be a good thing?
Will it be good for the environment?
I don't know. Is it a good thing as a currency? Well, never mind. So when you gather data, be it from social media or from somewhere else, it's usually, in the case of big data, it's not structured. It's collateral data, yeah? So this data needs to be structured. How do you do that? If you look into all the tweets that are around the ECB, how do you get an order into that? How do you understand what all the many voices say there? Who wants to answer?
Who uses Twitter data?
Yeah,
I do, but I'm a little bit afraid my connection might.
it seems good
Can
now.
you hear me?
Yeah, now it's
Okay.
good. Let's hope it holds.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, I think this is exactly the tricky bit about big data usage. You need to get structure into the data. And this is what I mentioned earlier on, where you need to have the necessary skills in-house to actually do this. And I think it's important there to marry data scientists with economists. I think you need both. You need to sort of think about, what is it I'm looking for? What am I after with all of this data? So we get a lot of data. There's many things we can do with them. Not all of them are interesting. So getting some, useful analysis out of the data, that's, I think, why we still need old-fashioned economists like me. Getting the structure onto the data, I think that's where we need sort of data scientists, and marrying the two, I think, is sort of the big job that we have to do here.
Yeah, let me maybe give you one example here also, because I also recently discussed this with a colleague here, right? Because you could easily go and say, look, let's just scrape all the Twitter data that we have available, but that would be extraordinarily big, right? So then you can make decisions. Okay, do you want to look at, for example, tweets that are only in English, right? Or do you actually interested also within the country in the speak in the individual languages of the country? Right. When you're interested in banks, for example, okay, let's try to figure out, let's kind of a dictionary, so to speak, about names or abbreviations associated with the different banks. Right? Do we actually need to know kind of from what countries these tweets have been sent and so on? So this way you can kind of try to bring a little bit more so-called structure into all of that data and try to portion it in a way that you actually need it, right? But as Michael said, I think first of all, you need to have an idea based with the question, what do you want to do? And then you have to have someone who is actually skilled in actually coding this and downloading this or collecting this in a most efficient way, so to speak.
Anything to add there, or is that?
Maybe apparently if my connection is back, response to Paula's earlier comment. So, this is exactly what we were trying to look at for our study with tweets about the ECB. Do tweets, the content, does the sentiment that gets expressed on tweets, does that change in response to our own communication? And we actually find that tweets are more factual after the various communications that we issue. So in that sense, I think we can actually make sure that the discussion on Twitter is less subjective, becomes more factual. We also find that, there's less heterogeneity in views. So we can, I think, also shape this discussion on social media to some extent.
Okay, so actually social media helps in a way to inform the public better. Yeah.
Well, there's risks and benefits here, as Paula pointed out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. If the
Exactly.
bubble,
So the point is that you need the central bank saying the right things. So if something can be misinterpreted or can be retweeted in a way that just exasperate the other set of agents that think otherwise, then yeah, you can create like a reinforcing cycle where actually a message that was meant to be of stability creates more instability.
Yeah. Also, we spoke about privacy concerns. Paula, could you give us a bit of an insight on where GDPR and other laws stand regarding the evaluation of social media data?
So I know that there are a lot of restrictions on what kind of data you can use and who it can be managed with, who can manage it. It has to be anonymous to begin with. But there are a lot of companies out there, for example, Google, that keeps running experiments on its user just because we click on accept without reading what we are accepting to. And then they use these experiments to create a better product in the sense that people use it more, and they will change the color of the search button in a section of users to see if that makes them use that search button more. So this kind of abuse of data, if you want to call it that way, is happening throughout. Like there is very little we can do as users to control that. We hope central banks manage it properly, and because of their business, they really try to, but it is always a fear in people's mind how their private information is going to be handled.
Yeah. So Michael, the power of the ECB is based on the trust we have in it. How secure, how regulated is the data that you handle, the big data? Yeah, how do you address the concerns that Paula mentioned that might come up in your institution?
Sure. I mean, first of all, big data is sensitive, or contains personal data. So there's a lot of big data, whatever sort of very high frequency financial market data. That falls under the definition by Sasha, but it's not personal data in any way. So I mean, we're talking about things like these tweets, where indeed people issue a tweet not thinking that this might be used by central banks to do research with it, but the same applies actually to academia as well. And they might be issuing tweets that allow us some influence on their political views or something like this. So this is clearly personal data. And as I tried to say beforehand, but maybe the connection got lost there, we are in very close contact with our data protection officer. And we have set up an agreement how we actually conduct this analysis, what data we take, what data we do not take, how we store it, who has access to this data, what results can be published subsequently, again, to be fully in line with the data protection rules.
So if I understand you correctly, our data is very safe with the ECB, as is our money, right?
I sincerely hope so.
Very good. So, Paula, are you optimistic about the future of big data processing? Where do you think we will be in 5 years?
I'm very optimistic because, as Michael alluded before, this amount of data is something that is just very tempting not to use. So it contains a lot of tools, and it allows you to answer a lot of interesting questions that you just couldn't possibly answer years ago. So because the biggest challenge I still feel is these skills, the data analysis skill to process it. I can see us in the near future shifting this set of skills from something that is good to have in the job market as musts, as something that you need to have in order to secure a job kind of in these top institutions, just because it's going to become very common and necessary almost if you want to understand how the world is behaving around you. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I think people are going to start using them more and more, and that will make also users more sensitive to what it means to have these digital trace around you all the time when you use the internet, when you use social media, and the implications that that can have for privacy.
Okay. And now, Sasha, could you take a look into your magic ball and tell us where big data will take us in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's always a good question is to look into a magic 8-ball. Yeah. But I think so. I think Paula was spot on in terms of how digitalization and the tools become part of our everyday life. And this will definitely also, or is reflected also from us as a business school in the way we teach students, of course. But I think one point also that has been addressed, the problem of data privacy, I think this becomes even more important going forward. Digitalization is also the amount of data and the amount of data that we share also, and basically in terms of big text and so on is increasing on an annual basis. Also, COVID or the pandemic has actually even magnified that overall effect. But it could also be, and that might be another concern, is that not everybody benefits to the same degree, right? It could be very asymmetric. There are people who are really really benefiting a lot and who can adopt that kind of new technology a lot, and some people that cannot do that. And so the question will be, in addition to, do we need to improve also our data security laws? And there will be probably a lot of regulation coming up also in terms of big tech, or maybe also the fintech companies or the platforms using that or producing the data, but also in terms of how can we make sure that that kind of these digital technologies are used in a not only safe but also more inclusive way, that more of all of in society are actually benefiting from that.
Okay, yeah, it would be nice if big data actually had an impact on the less lucky people in the world.
I can give an example that it doesn't necessarily relate to the less lucky people, but when one is analyzing these sets of big data, like the Twitter data, that usually requires a dictionary, and a dictionary where you can learn these features. And one common problem in the English language is that gender is not associated with the noun. So if you say doctor, you don't know if it's a female doctor or a male doctor. So usually when these data gets processed, because it is based on the most available information online, it tends to classify all doctors as males. So females tend to get underrepresented. And if we are analyzing labor market participation, for example, we could easily underestimate the amount of female doctors out there just because we are thinking that all that are doctors are male doctors. So those kinds of inequalities that are already in society can get magnified by using algorithms that are based on what is already there.
So what would you have to do to make the female doctors visible?
You will have to have data sets where you train your algorithms that have kind of tickle the equality such that you have enough, like the same amount of female doctor and male doctors. So you have the same problem with nurses, for example. If you translate nurse from different languages, then it will most likely identify it as a female nurse, when a nurse can be both male and female. So this just reinforces whatever classifications you have. So algorithms that add structure to data are as smart as the data you give them to learn from. And if there are inequalities, which they are in our world right now, we just have to be conscious that by blindly giving algorithms these data to process, they will just exacerbate them.
Okay, so we need smart people to train them well, right?
Yeah, just be aware that they have these kind of biases.
Okay, good. In case people are really interested in what we talked about, could you recommend any sources where people can actually dig deeper? Maybe Michael, do you have somewhere where people can go?
Sure. I mean, here comes my 30-second marketing plot for our own work, obviously. So the ECB, like probably most central banks, if not all central banks, has a working paper series where we publish the results of our research and analysis. If you go to the ECB's website, you'll find it there. And you can just enter a search term. You can filter the various papers there, enter big data, and you see a lot of interesting applications, which gets you very close to this question, what do central banks do with big data?
If you're on YouTube and in the chat, I guess my wonderful assistant Luisa just posted the link to that database. And I believe also, Sasha, you have some information for curious minds.
So so one thing that we did, it's a very rough and very preliminary draft, but also when we started working on that, we wrote a very short paper on what's the title, on use of machine learning in central banking, which is available on my website, but also the Frankfurt School website of the financial big data cluster, which is linked there, has also a lot of basically a link to that paper, but also then in the next couple of months also link to the new work that we're going to upload there. And then within that paper, for example, there's a bunch of references interesting people might look at if they would like to know a little bit more about that.
Okay, now I have some closing questions prepared that will bring together everything we said before, as a short summary for the people who did not maybe watch the whole video. I'll start with Sasha again. What are the benefits we can gather from big data in the future? Just the 3 big benefits, if you have them.
Well, there's a lot of benefits. So I think what do we have? We have the ability to ask questions. We have actually the benefit of having better data to answer questions that we've been already interested or already worked on, and we just have the opportunity to become much more efficient, right, and much more also more precise in our prediction, for example, and the way we kind of analyze things.
Okay, this is the good that might come. Paula, you being the devil's advocate, where do you see the biggest risks in the future, apart maybe from the bias that you already mentioned just now, that big data might bring?
So I think big data can bring a lot of risk in terms of, this way that data gets stored, and if people fear how it is going to be used, then it can create a coordination failure. So maybe if a future central bank president says, we will do whatever it takes to stabilize the currency, social media may exasperate that and react by saying it is not enough and create a run where everybody sells their euros and buys dollars instead to use as means of payments and to store value. So that's something that just by the nature of social media is very easy to create these reinforcing cycles that can be virtuous cycles, so something good, or they can be as well vicious cycles where negative ideas for the central banks just reproduce over and over.
Okay, so it can go up or down depending on the dynamics.
It's just a magnifier. So
yeah,
it can be amplified for good or bad.
Yeah, we have just now experienced this with this wonderful Instagram picture of those 4 famous politicians. They are spiraling up, I think. Final question for Michael from my side. What do you think central banks need to do to successfully get the most out of big data? What is the Stellschraube, maybe?
So again, let me try to think about the big 3 things to think about. Well, one is we're still on a learning curve. We still, I think, economics and finance in general, and central banks as part of that, we are far behind other sciences in applying big data. So I think, we need to be more active, sort of marry more with data scientists in general, learn from other disciplines. That's one thing. The second, what I mentioned earlier on already, is, stay focused. Think about what do we want to do with the data, where is it useful and where is it not useful, where might it even be problematic if we actually continue using that. And then something we talked a lot about already is, use the data responsibly to make sure we maintain trust. I think that would be my top 3.
Very good. Thank you. Now we have some questions from the audience. Luisa, how many have we got? 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'll start with the first one. It's from someone called Malte, and he's asking, what's your view on new big data privacy and monetization development in blockchain? For example, companies like Ocean Data Marketplace, Ocean Protocol. Is any of you familiar with that topic, with that question? Oh, there's silence. So
Well, I just want to say that one general fear with these digital currencies are that they can either be used to store value or they can be used as a mean of payment. So if I know that my Bitcoin is going to earn a lot of money, there is no reason for me to sell it for a Coke ever or for a car ever because I think it's just going to go up. That's a world with permanent deflation, and that's something we wouldn't like to live, as we don't want a world with permanent inflation because it takes our mind out from the real things that, well, Michael was alluding, the central bank takes our head off so we can concentrate on those. One other thing is that although many of these protocols are called to be anonymous and try to hide identity of or like allow for keeping privacy on check, at the same time there are several companies that specialize in trying to map users by their transactions into these different wallets, such that it becomes an issue at the end because having a public ledger means you can actually track back each transaction that everyone has ever done ever since they opened that wallet. So it is very anonymous if you never know which wallet belongs to whom. But if by some means a wallet gets identified, then it is completely public because that way, yeah, you can see all the transactions that have been done associated with that wallet.
okay. Next question is a critical one from Veronica. She says, you are talking a lot about the ECB using social media to distribute their content, but that's not new, okay? What is the actual use for central bank policy? You are mixing up social media data as input for central bank policy and using social media. Can you scroll? Can you make it? I can't see the end of the question. And using social media for content distribution? Ich muss scrollen. Well, Technik. Kannst du den Anfang von der Frage löschen? Dann scrollt es hoch. What kind of long question is this? How should I read this? So I think her point is, I don't get her point. I'm sorry.
Well, let me try to come in here. So, I mean, there are things that are new. There's sort of a strongly increased use of social media to convey central bank information. It's true that central banks have been doing this for a while, but sort of it comes at a much higher intensity. There's more effort being put into this. More generally, there's more effort into communicating with the general public. The ECB is only one central bank that is doing this right now. Many others are doing the same. The Bank of England, for example, is putting a lot of effort into this. So this is new. I mean, this is indeed, one way of communicating ECB's views out to the public. There's also basically more sort of, central banks are more in a listening mode. Okay, so for example, there's Q&A sessions on Twitter that central bankers are now offering in many central banks. So there's more like a mode whereby central banks can also listen to the concerns of the people. And many central banks have now started what they call listening events, where they invite people, representatives of the general public, to the central bank to hear what their concerns are. So there's much more emphasis on listening. There's more emphasis on using social media to convey information out. But again, how does this feed into policy? Well, I mean, I think it's important to understand to what extent are central banks being trusted, for example. What is the view of the general public about the central banks? This is something that Paula has alluded to earlier on. We know that central banks generally have been losing a lot of trust ever since the global financial crisis, it's important that we keep the trust or we regain it. And so we need the tools to actually monitor these things. So how are central banks being discussed in the public discourse? And social media is an important part of that. So it does actually feed into policy relevant questions.
Thank you. Now my technique here is much better. And I have a next question. It says social media data is categorized as public data. And do the data protection regulations apply here? What about the right to be forgotten? Does Twitter data fall under this category?
Do we have a lawyer here?
No, we haven't. We have one actually, but he's not part of the discussion. So we pass that on to a lawyer. Okay. How does the ECB make sure to use data responsibly? Is the next question.
Yeah, again, I hope I said what I had to say. I mean, first of all, we're discussing a lot about data that are subject to data protection issues. This is a very, very tiny fraction of the big data that we're analyzing. I mean, the vast more than 99% of the data is not subject to these regulations. So look at this. But then for data that are private data, again, I can tell you that for the project that I'm working on, we only have basically 2 people have access to this data. It's in a strictly secured area where only 2 people have access to the data. We basically have sort of signed a confidentiality agreement with our data protection officer. We have sort of clear rules about what can be published. Again, this is analysis that we want to put out as research articles. So we are very cautious about what we publish. We would not publish an individual tweet. And again, all of this is in very close collaboration with the data protection officer.
Okay, so the data protection officer was mentioned a lot, and I believe he or she is a very responsible person and does a good job. The final question from the audience. How reliable is social media for important monetary policy decisions? Does the ECB have any control mechanisms in place to filter the data?
I mean, this relates to the earlier question, right? How does this feed into policy decisions? So, I mean, if the question here is, is social media is a discussion on social media relevant for the next monetary policy decision about, should there be more or less purchases of government bonds, or should interest rates go up or down? This is not the way I would see these data feed into policy. Again, I think we need to think about this more on a longer term perspective. Do we have of the public? How is the ECB's policy being discussed? So it doesn't feed in at a high frequency. It feeds in more sort of as a background analysis. And admittedly, now I have forgotten the second. Oh, do we filter the data? I mean, we monitor the data. So we have colleagues in the communications department. They are obviously trying to understand what's going on in social media. They have monitoring function. So we're looking at this. Do we filter this? I'm not sure what this question means. I mean, we obviously look at everything that is out there.
Well, I think that is a valid answer. Thank you. And that was also the last question from the chat. Yeah, Luisa tells me there are no more questions. So we're at the end of our wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for being part of it. Thank you to the audience for being with us. I'm sorry for the tiny little technical problems that might have appeared, but that's what happens when you go live. So thank you very much, Paula, Sasha, and Michael. It was an honor to have you here. I really look forward to maybe someday seeing you in person, and then we do it again, sitting on chairs, drinking water and, really chatting and not having technical issues at all. Thanks so much for joining me today. Also, thank you to the technical people here at Tech Quartier. Thank you to Pascal and Luisa. That's it. We're doing this again. There will be a safeFBDC Live number 3, and then we might talk about ethical AI, something we slightly touched today also, but I think there's a lot more to talk about. So, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.